delighted to introduce Dr. Patrick Curry, who many of you already know. And Patrick will be, the title of his talk is The Nature of Myth. Patrick has been a lecturer at the Universities of Bath Spa, teaching the MA in Cultural Astronomy and Astrology, and Kent, teaching the MA in the Cultural Study of Cosmology and Divination. He has published books and papers on the history of astrology, the philosophy of divination, the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, and environmental philosophy. In 2019, Patrick's book, Enchantment, Wonder in Modern Life, was published. His new book, Art and Enchantment, How Wonder Works, is out now. And you can have a look at our website to find the link to that book. In fact, I'll put it in the chat now. But without further ado, I shall hand over to the wonderful Patrick Curry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. And so my talk is entitled The Nature of Myth. It's kind of a feeble pun because, so the nature of myth as what makes myth myth? What is its nature? And at the same time, I'm going to suggest that in trying to answer that question, we end up with nature in the sense of the natural world. So there's a double meaning there. So basically, what I'm going to try and do, and the timing is always delicate. I sometimes feel with talks that I have a choice of either making it too short or overrunning. So if I have to choose between the two, I'll make it a bit short so there's time for discussion. Basically, all I'm going to do is share some thoughts, including feelings, about myth with you, what I've learned along the way. I've garnered these ideas from my own life experience, of course, plus the work of others I've read, scholars in particular, but other kinds of writers as well. And I find that when other people's thoughts illuminate my experience, and conversely, when my life illuminates those thoughts, oh, that's what she meant, or whatever, then life and work resonate together. And there's really no need to choose between them. W.B. Yeats suggested in a famous poem that you couldn't avoid choosing between the life and the work, but I don't think that's always true. In fact, in practice, life and work are impossible to separate completely. So then the challenge becomes to how to convey these ideas in a way that allows that resonance to be heard by others. So my account is very personal, but I think that is exactly what it permits it to be universal in the only available sense, which is that other people, potentially, it's true for other people who find it true for themselves as well. The kind of universalism, a humble kind and the real kind, I think. What is the nature of myth? As I said, we'll end by considering that subject in another and further sense, namely the rootedness of myth in nature and as nature. But where to begin? Perhaps it will do as a starting point to say that myth is encoded human experience, especially emotional experience, and acculturated cultural wisdom. It's encoded experience of existential situations and wisdom about existential situations, birth and death, love and hate, self and others, which remain as powerful now as they ever were thousands and hundreds of thousands of years ago. That hasn't changed. So obviously it's tempting to go on and ask, well, what is fundamental then about myth? This is kind of a logos-ridden question, which doesn't really get us very far. And let me try and tell you why. Considered subjectively, i.e. how we experience myth, Roberto Calasso says, every sudden heightening of intensity, end quote, means that you are in the presence of a god, and there's what he calls their sphere of influence. While objectively, he says, myth is the precedent behind every action, its invisible, ever-present lining. So by objectively, I mean, he's suggesting that's what's really going on with when myth is happening. That's an interesting description of myth as the ever-present lining of every action, because it corresponds very precisely with what the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty describes as an idea which is, quote, not the contrary of the sensible, what you can access with your senses, not its opposite, but is its lining and depth. Idea which is the lining and depth of the sensible, not its opposite, end quote. So we're speaking about something, and I'm suggesting this something includes myth, which is not supernatural, that is to say, supernatural, added to the natural world, nor is it transcendentally mystical, floating somewhere above it or beyond it, but is immanent in the natural world, which includes us as natural beings. So the upshot, returning to the question of what is fundamental about myth, is that there are no inherent restrictions on what activity, whether you consider it to be inner or outer, can be mythic. What is fundamental to myth, then, is that it is always and everywhere potentially fundamental. I threw in that potentially. I'm not saying necessarily fundamental in every situation, always and everywhere, but potentially. And why did I add that? Well, I added that to remind us that in practice, the reality of myth, like everything else, is a matter of personal experience. So I'm trying to protect myth and protect us from what you might call the curse of monotheism, which a writer, a scholar called Barbara Herrnstein Smith once described as, quote, trying to identify the supposedly universally compelling truth with a capital T and way with a capital W, and to compel it universally. Trying to compel the supposedly universally compelling truth and way, and then because life is so ragged and we are so diverse and perverse, you find, oh, well, the only way to get everybody to agree to this supposedly universal truth is to force them to agree in one way, subtly or grossly. I want to avoid that fate for myth and for everything else. Right, now this perspective that I've just been talking about can be developed further. For example, consider the weapons long used against myth, beginning with logos and mutating into the reason of both religious monotheism and secular rationalism, and including its later variant, modern science. Are not these weapons logos, written weapons, or derived? Are they not non-mythic or even anti-mythic? Well, I think the short answer is no, at least in the sense that the only way for these critical weapons to gain any purchase against myth is to themselves become mythic, especially as Apollonian power knowledge. You remember Apollo claimed to be the only god who knew entirely the mind of Zeus. He reserved that right. He said to Hermes, oh, you can have fortune telling and divination, but I know the complete contents of the mind of the chief god. Okay, so if critical attacks on myth are to gain any purchase, they tend to, they have no choice but to become usually Apollonian power knowledge. Sometimes, of course, also the cruel stratagems of Athena, who was a rationalist in her own way, although everything was strategic, or the sly mockery of Hermes, another kind of reason in its own way that can be turned on myth. Now, extremely influentially, Plato, using myth, okay, or mythos, sought to position myth as an inferior kind of truth to logos. Logos is a term and a value which already at that point contained the seeds not only of the exhaustively complete and authoritative word with a capital W and knowledge of that kind, cognate knowledge, but also its modern scientific materialist version, whose ideal is knowledge of the system from which all and everything follows. This is what Horkheimer and Adorno described as the ideal of modernity. Okay, why would that be so great to have knowledge of the system from which all and everything follows? Because anybody who had that knowledge would be in a position of being master of it. So it's the promise of mastery being held out here, as we find so often in modernity. The result, beloved of modernity, is what's been called the myth of mythlessness. In other words, the conviction that it is possible, and by the way, desirable, to be completely devoid of mythicity, to be without myth. And myth in that case gets reduced to merely other people, not ourselves, having erroneous beliefs, whereas we have true knowledge. Okay. The problem with that is already, I should think, pretty obvious. As John Moriarty, a modern Irish mystic, puts it, myth, not maths, is the mother tongue. Myth, not maths, is the mother tongue. Not that maths is outside myth or is rejected by it, but ultimately maths too is mythic and, as I said, specifically Apollonian. So as Paul Ricoeur, another French philosopher, points out, quote, the claim of logos to rule over mythos is itself a mythical claim. There's just no getting away from myth in that sense. And what kind of claim would that be, to rule over myth? In another short answer, surely it is a male claim in an all too familiar, narcissistic, egotistic, arrogant mode. It might take a brave mythicist to describe Apollo that way, but only a dishonest one could deny that it's true. Now, the resulting damage to our mythic mother tongue, not our maths mother tongue, but our mythic chthonic mother tongue, manifesting in ecological disaster, I think is now overwhelmingly obvious out in the world. And it's also obvious in terms of all sorts of mental illnesses and stresses and strains and breakdowns that are happening everywhere. But myth as the mother tongue is the only way we can understand, honor, and work with the maternal matrix of life, which is the earth. That is to say, understand, honor, and work with as opposed to dominating and exploiting. And we can see how that's working out not so well. As a writer called Sean Kane says, and I'll be returning to Sean's work, all the work that various peoples have done, all the work that peoples must do to live on the earth's terms, is preempted by the dream of transcendence. As an aside, I was reading a poem by W.H. Auden recently, in which his term for the earth is Dame Kind. And at one point he remarks in the poem, she mayn't be all she might be, but she is our mum, which I liked. The destructiveness, including self-destructiveness, of modernist anti-mythicity is capped by its cunning, inherited from Plato, but still at work, because the actual lie is that myth lies. That's the lie, not myth itself. In the words of Doris Lessing, myth, quote, myth does not mean something untrue, but a concentration of truth, end quote. So the only way myth can be fully and properly appreciated is by abandoning the abstract, the emaciatedly abstract and politically interested notion of truth espoused by myth's modernist critics. As a scholar called Milton Scarborough writes, quote, the ultimate assessment of myth must be of a kind suited to the nature of myth, as giving expressions to apprehensions of the life world and an orientation for living in that world. That's what myth is about. Within those strictures, which are pretty wide strictures, myth is neither true nor false in a theoretical sense. Rather, it is viable or not viable for the tasks which confront us. This viability is not determined in intellectual terms, but in the very process of living, end quote. Or to echo a call by an anthropologist, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, quote, we need richer ontologies. That is to say, worlds, apprehensions of worlds, sensibilities of worlds. It is high time, this is the rest of his quote, to put epistemological questions, that is strictly to do with knowing and believing. It is high time to put epistemological questions to rest. And myth is nothing if not ontological, a matter that is of being. So let's look at this image of myth that is, we've inherited, this idea that it's false belief, that it's illusion, that it's childish, that it's superstition, and so on. Very durable image. This partisan and prescriptive image of myth, which is disguised as being an objective description of it, it has its roots in Platonic enmity on several fronts. Plato and his followers were great, as I've said elsewhere, great haters. Okay, they were really good at it. Enmity to Homer as a purveyor of mere stories, as opposed to the idea of truth that Plato put forward, modeled on Pythagorean mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4, in any possible world, as modern philosophers like to say, and Parmenidean universalist realism, which I won't go into here. Enmity to Heraclitus as a false teacher of truth as something constantly changing and transforming. You know, Heraclitus, you can never step in the same river twice, okay, etc. Why would Plato and his Platonists dislike that? Because if the truth won't hold still, then it cannot be used to legitimate the authority of a caste of philosophers to say what is true and what isn't true. Because they say, oh, that's true. Oh, it's already changed. Okay, no, already changed. So Heraclitus is not their favorite philosopher. Enmity to demos, the masses, literally the mob, for clinging to doxa, mere opinions, and thus being vulnerable to persuasion by mere rhetoric. Here's another paradox with Plato, which is very typical. He bitterly attacked rhetoric, using brilliant rhetoric to do so. He used myth to undermine myth. In the case of the rhetoric, he criticized the masses for being vulnerable to persuasion by rhetoric that what is true is not true. A silver-tongued orator can persuade you that what is true is not true, or that what isn't true is true. Hence, of course, in the Republic, the notorious banishment of poets and the suppression of any unlicensed music. It's not coincidental. But the influence of this picture has lasted right into the ongoing project of modernity, which one eco-philosopher defined as the rational mastery of nature. We can't have We can't have poets and musicians and artists upsetting people and giving them strange ideas if we really are serious about the rational mastery of nature. Indeed, the attempted sacrifice of myth on the altar of logos as the truth with a capital T and way with a capital W is central to that project of mastery. Fortunately, says Curry, it can't be done. It can only pretend to be done. Why not? For one thing, myth won't hold still for long enough to be pinned down in that sort of way. For another, as I've already suggested, the very attempt to prosecute this program is itself mythic, albeit perhaps not of a very edifying kind. By the same token, to demand, to ask for the thing itself and not the myth, give me the thing itself, not the myth about it, is completely absurd at best. Because precisely when it is most itself, the thing, whatever it is deeply mythic. And when it is most mythic, it is most itself. For the same reason, if we try to stand entirely outside myth, including perhaps in order to examine it, we must also stand outside something essential to life, including ourselves. Only an alienation on that scale permits treating myth as something to be intellectually dissected. Myth is not a proposition. It doesn't consist of so-called beliefs. It is above all a way of life, of being in the world, which must therefore be inhabited before it can be understood. Now, it can be inhabited with some distance involved. If there's a sweet spot of distance involved in inhabiting a myth and understanding it. If you are too deeply into it, you can't say anything about it, which is fair enough, but you may want to say something about it. If you have too much distance, you can't really say anything about it either because you're not understanding it clearly. So there is a median point of inhabiting it with a bit of distance between you and it, or whatever part of it you're considering, okay? But in any case, what myth demands of us, therefore, in the words of the great Indo-mythologist Heinrich Zimmer, quote, is not the monologue of a coroner's report, which is so, let me interject, so often the form of modern academic treatments of myth, a coroner's report, but quote, the dialogue of a living conversation. This sense of a living conversation with myth is sadly missing in many academic studies, whose practitioners, fastidiously confine themselves to concepts alone. And then concepts about something that apparently is merely then and there. It's not happening here, it's not happening now, and it certainly doesn't include or involve us. And these people seem to be afraid of their own shadows. I'm not advocating trying to collapse any distinction between mythic and non-mythic life. Non-mythic life is daily, quotidian, disenchanted, perhaps. Taken too far, that disenchanted, non-mythic, apparently non-mythic life is almost certainly a degenerate version of logos. And in that extent, it is mythic. The ideal of logos, the shining ideal, is bureaucracy, rationalization, and modernization. Just what Max Weber said was disenchanting the world. But this is not to romanticize mythos either, because it too has a degenerate version, or versions. That might be the mindless, gory violence of Ares, the god, not the sign, or the exercise of power which recognizes no limits of Zeus, or the cold cruelty of the brother and sister Apollo and Artemis. Nevertheless, since we are humans, not gods or goddesses, and division is of our essence, we need both mythic and non-mythic, or that is to say, mythic and logos, not forgetting that these are not symmetrical opposites, but mythos includes and contains logos. We need both in order to stay sane, in order to recognize when myth is happening particularly powerfully, and with any luck, and by the way, that's another goddess, Fortuna, with any luck to be able to respond intelligently. So that's another reason to retain the word potentially when describing myth as fundamental. I'm not suggesting it's always in practice, necessarily always and everywhere fundamental. Another modern, or perhaps I should say modernist, misunderstanding of myth is to treat it as purely psychology. In Sean Kane's words, cutting across cultural difference with the mistaken assumption that there is a universal world of myth which is true to all peoples in past and present because it is true to eternal powers in the human mind. Well, certainly myth is universal, but myths, specific myths, are not necessarily. In any case, this understanding, the psychological, overly or purely psychological understanding of myth, plays straight into the hands of the modernists, and specifically Cartesians or neo-Cartesians, who want to divide everything into two: mind, formerly spirit, sometimes still spirit, versus the world, subject versus object, spirit versus matter, leaving the body usually positioned as a battleground for these two. This kind of splitting, the Cartesians and modernists think, offers a chance to master their half of things. We'll take care of matter, object, and body, and then, having mastered it, reduce the other to what their supposed area of expertise is. Oh, mind is just a version of body. Spirit is just a weird kind of matter. Self is just a function of the world, material world, etc. Okay. Here again is the crypto-mythic dream of mastery. Again, it's also, Max Weber argued, the fundamental act, this splitting, okay, by which the world and self, which is all these things, spirit, mind, body, matter, world, self, and therefore, of course, it's unmasterable because it includes you. The part cannot master the whole, okay? It's part of the whole. Max Weber said, this is the fundamental act by which the world and self becomes disenchanted and therefore meaningless. Psychologism also overlooks the vital point that myth should not be identified with the self or mind or spirit or subject alone. Why? Because myth is the lining and depth, the very meaning of both self and world, of both subject and object, and so on. Both psyche and world have an inner mythic dimension, inner in quotation marks. So as a philosopher of music called, with the wonderful name of Victor Zuckerkandl, says, quote, it's not a question of psychological experiences that we recognize as our within, but a mode of existence of the world that is of the same nature as the within of my psyche. This seems to me a very important point. Our psyche, our mind, ourselves, has a within. The world, material, matter, physical world, etc., also has a within. And that within is where the mythic comes to life. So it's not just confined to our heads. It's not just happening in our heads any more than it's just happening out there. It's happening in the inner dimension of both self and world. Relatedly, perhaps, the philosopher Wittgenstein, who almost didn't mince his words, put it this way. I think it's essentially, it's either the same point or a related point. Quote, the physiological life is naturally not life, and neither is psychological life. Life, he said, is the world, the whole thing, including us. And in our relationships with the world's fundamental realities, the realities of the world, including us, to revert to Roberto Calasso, all we moderns, quote, all we moderns have done is invent for those powers that act upon us longer, more numerous, more awkward names, which are less effective than the old names. I think synchronicity is a very good candidate for this. Synchronicity sort of is a trying too hard to be scientific, to be safe, secure, it's okay, nothing strange is going. Yes, when there is what we call synchronicity happening, there is something strange happening, and it's mythic. I prefer the term resonance. Okay. In any case, where have we left nature? How am I doing? Oh dear. Okay. Where have we left nature in all this? Well, we haven't left nature because we can't. Sean Kane, whose account informs mine here, points out that as one follows myth back to its source through the better part of nearly 100,000 years of myth-telling, what we increasingly find is the mythic dimension of the earth itself, and inseparably the earthy dimension of myth. Proceed past the shiny, smooth myths of modernity, through the Neolithic's anthropomorphic pantheon, albeit extremely numinous, but okay, dominated by male sky gods, but still with room for the enchantment of more Olympian, more ancient pre-Olympian deities like Aphrodite and Hermes, who are very old. Go further back and down into the darker, older, female and chthonic world of the Paleolithic, full of exchanges between gods, humans, and other animals, and startling transformations from one into the other. And it soon becomes clear how parochial it is to define myth as, quote, stories about gods. Rather, they are about what Sean Kane calls something mysterious, intelligent, invisible, and whole. And this something mysterious includes but exceeds later and qualifies later myths, just as nature includes but exceeds humans. We are the preeminently cultural animal, but we are animal nonetheless for that. Now, in Sean Kane's words, this mysterious something, which is the subject and mode of myth, inheres in, quote, the ideas and emotions of the earth. He explains it further as myth, that is, wisdom about nature. That wisdom heard and told in animated pattern, that pattern rendered in such a way as to preserve a place, whole and sacred, safe from human meddling. These are the concepts with which to begin an exploration of myth. And he adds that of these, the notion of the sanctity of place is vital. It anchors the other concepts. Once the power of place is lost to memory, myth is uprooted. Knowledge of the earth's processes become a different kind of knowledge, manipulated and applied by man, end quote. Here's where we need a distinction which the ancient Greeks again offered us between space and place, and a parallel between time and moment. Myth takes place in a place and in a moment, or as a moment. It does not take place in space or in time. But this kind of origin in a certain understanding of the natural world should not be understood as merely atavistic or merely antiquarian. because it is formative, so it's still very much at work. Mythical nature and natural myth are nearly purely past, nor necessarily elsewhere. As Bruno Latour reminds us, we have never been entirely or consistently modern. We're an analog animal, you might put it that way. Moments of enchantment make it possible to apprehend myth as still taking place wherever you are. Where you are, in Tolkien's terms, was, at that moment, in fairy. To take another example, an Apache myth teller or placemaker, as this scholar Keith Basso significantly calls them, placemakers, often speaks as a witness when he's telling a story, a witness on the scene describing ancestral events from long ago as they are occurring and creating, this is my words now, creating in the process a vivid sense that what happened long ago, right here on this very spot, could be happening and in some sense is still happening right now. This kind of awareness is not limited to Indigenous people, although I just want to point out that when it comes to the earth, all humans are Indigenous. One of the virtues of Roberto Calasso's book on myth is that it treats myth rightly as something that is still happening here and now, if not literally here and now, then around the corner. Respecting chthonic myth, that is earthly myth more specifically, Gaston Bachelard says of wild nature that, quote, in the vast world of the non-I, of everything that isn't me, the non-I of fields is not the same as the non-I of forests, because the forest is temporally before me. It took place before me, before us. Whereas for fields and meadows, my dreams and recollections accompany all the different phases of tilling and harvesting, but forests reign in the past, end quote. Hence the perpetually endangered character of enchanted nature, always disappearing as it withdraws from the ongoing development of human reason. But this tragic flaw, as it might be, is inseparable from its great virtue. For this past I'm talking about here is not strictly chronological. It's not time, it's moment. And the forest one walks in now, although it only reigns supreme in the temporal past, still exists and is still happening in a mythic present, which is why, entering a forest, we often also enter an enchanted state, which is to say, a mythic condition. It's the perilous place, both psychic and material, where all that has made you who you are is still happening, and where, right now, you may be renewed or undone. Tolkien always used the word perilous in association with enchantment. This kind of sensibility is very much evident in the literary forests of Tolkien, of course, and it's still available through his literary forests. So when it comes to myth and nature, we seem to have arrived, as T.S. Eliot says in one of his poems, quote, where we started, but know the place for the first time. Continually doing this, I suspect, necessarily after each forgetting. Thank you.